All right. Thanks, everybody. And I'm so excited to be here. So our goal of this presentation is to introduce to you the idea of a business objectives model. We'll walk through it in a little bit about why we need to think about them in the first place. We're going to describe how we create these business objective models and using that model to come up with maybe some of our key results and then tie them back to our backlog items. So I will start today by saying that I find that most projects in most companies that we work with really struggle to figure out what to build first and often have no sense of whether or not they can actually deliver the business value that's needed in the organization. So today's talk is in context of offering some very practical tips that hopefully you can use on your own projects and your own programs. And we'll do a very light some examples along the way here as well. So a long time ago, those of us who've been around for a while, we used to talk about how do we get our projects done on time. And we used to describe a method where you had to cut as much of your project as possible in order to increase your time to market. I can even remember a project where that we had an expected return of $14 million, but the functionality had to be implemented by the holidays. All of our stakeholders were fixed on a set scope, right? It had to be all of this or none of this. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this story later on in our presentation. But the point of me of sharing it now is that this is exactly what kept our stakeholders up at night a number of years ago. Fast forward to today, and the world's a different place. Not only do we care about delivering on time, but now we have to do it with a whole lot less money. CIO magazine even reported that the majority of CIOs say that new project spend is being cut dramatically. And we're seeing it in the news as many large tech companies are having layoffs. And so this is something that we're battling and dealing with all the time and even today. So with our budgets being so tight, what we're talking about is cutting as many non-essential features as our programs as possible. For example, we had two projects, each costing $1 million to deploy. One had a return of $20 million and the other one was $4 million. So what would you do? Would you do one or both? Both have a positive return on investment, so we should do both, right? No, not so fast. We would suggest that you only focus on the $20 million one to reduce your risk of them both failing. And to sum it up, this is all really about hard prioritization choices, really based on value. So we're literally cutting projects to the bone. And again, maybe some of you aren't really having to do this yet, but what a great practice to be thinking about all the time. Even if you don't necessarily have budget issues or concerns, really going through and thinking, do we need this feature? What is our minimal viable product? What is it that we really have to have, and focus on delivering those first? And by the way, I just kind of love this whole little cartoon here. Just, how shocking that amputation happened to be. So the Standish Group actually produces this survey every now and then about the chaos report. And they talk about how years ago and even today, that of commercial software, 65% of the features that are built are rarely or never used. And if we can find those features and not build them in the first place, we can literally save tons and tons of money. So let me give you an example here. Pull up Outlook, right? Email today, and look at all the different features that you can see in Outlook. Now, this is a very simple example, but just in Outlook, within 30 seconds, I was able to find 3 things that I didn't even know were there, and why is it there? And this is an example of what commercial software has. And if we're going to rebuild it, do we really need all of these features? And so imagine things like Excel or PowerPoint, or even the things that your phone does these days, right? They all do lots of different things. Do we actually use all of them? Would it be better if maybe we never built those things that are rarely or never used? So, how do we decide, in these tough economic times, and they're forecasting it may get worse, how do we decide what features to cut from our projects? Well, here's a few methods that we can all try, and I'm sure many of you have done this already. I know I've seen it on some of the projects that I've done over the years, right? The squeakiest wheel, right? You know who they are. The person that just complains and is the loudest and is always talking, I need this, I need this, I need this. Maybe it's the most senior person in the room. Maybe it's the last person who yelled at us. Perhaps maybe we should just roll the dice, or maybe just put all our features up on a big, bulletin board and throw darts, and whatever our dart hits, that's what we build. I even worked with a company once where the CEO was headed to give a keynote address to all of the salespeople. Large organization, 30,000 salespeople in this room. And on his way to the podium, another salesperson caught him and said, hey, it'd be really great if our software did X. And the CEO agreed. And as he got up there and gave his keynote address, he announced that the software was now going to do this feature and even gave it a date. Now, nobody in IT had ever heard of this before. Nobody in the marketing department ever heard this before. And we're all sitting there saying, excuse me, Mr. CEO, can you repeat that again? Because we want to make sure we got your requirements right and when we need to deliver this by. Right? I wish I could make that story up, but it really did happen, right? There was no consideration as to whether or not it was something that was really valuable, whether or not it was something that was actually needed. It just had already been announced, and guess what IT now had to build, right? So it's probably not the best way. And what we recommend is that we actually select features that add the most value. And we do this by using business objectives. All right, so that's why we care. Now let's talk about what business objectives actually are. You've probably heard this phrase, and so you may have some ideas in your head on what are business objectives. So maybe it's, what it is that the company wants to accomplish, or perhaps it's something along the lines of we need to get this built by this time frame, going back to my example of that CEO announcing something. But what we're going to use for our presentation today, or for our definition, is that the business objectives are the business benefit that the organization expects to receive. Now, how do we actually identify them? Now, this is going to sound actually very simple, but I can promise you it's not. Having doing this over and over again on a number of projects, it's not as easy as it sounds to get really good business objectives. But the first thing you really need to do is you got to get with the right stakeholders for your project. And you basically continually ask them, why are we building this product? Why do they care about solving the problem? Until you get a really clear example. Now, sometimes you will start with the objectives and maybe your key results, but then how do you know you've got the right ones? And this is where asking why comes in handy. It helps you to identify the business problem that you're really trying to solve for. By asking why is that an objective, it gets you to the business problem that they're trying to solve. This way, it helps you ensure that your objectives and your key results aren't tied to something that's not necessarily important to the business. Now, to be fair, all right, I'm not advocating that we act like toddlers and go, why? Because that's frustrating. And chances are you asking why in different ways and different formats will likely frustrate some people in this process. So you do have to be ready to explain the value of you asking why, right? It actually happened to me. I had someone ask, what right do you have to ask me about my business objectives? And I had to back off my questioning and explain to him the value of understanding them. Now, on this particular project, we had a previous business owner that had simply wanted or simply stated that he wanted to replace an existing system with something that was comparable. I knew that this new business owner did not like what the development was building. And we were concerned that the business owner had different objectives. And if we didn't understand them, then we'd re-implement what we already had. And that's not what he was after. So when we explained that to him, he immediately was willing to provide the objectives that he cared about. And it allowed us to pivot our project to make sure that we were building what he thought was important and what they was trying to accomplish and achieve. Now, we find that most business objectives, I'm not going to say all, but most business objectives are usually related to money in some form or fashion. Right. And so this could be relating to revenue, profits, maybe even costs to the company. Now, every customer is unique. And so this is not necessarily a hard and fast rule. And sometimes there's a lot of proxies for money. So for example, it could be improved customer satisfaction ratings. That might work because that should lead to more revenue. It could be maybe we want to increase our enrollment in something. All right. Or we want to, decrease our costs because we're spending a lot of money on this. But for most for-profit organization, there is an expectation that there is a money objective somewhere. And it's up for us to determine just, what that might be. All right. So if you hear an objective of, well, I want to combine 7 systems into one. Well, that's a strategy, right? That's not an objective, right? And we're going to cover that in a minute. But the business really never cares about how we get there, right? They want to understand, they really care about really kind of solving that problem. And, combining 7 systems into one is a strategy to reduce our costs, right? So what they really care about is reducing the costs. All right, so that's how we define business objectives. Now let's talk about using them. So experiences for us have demonstrated that most projects that we start with the equivalent of a product concept, right? Which could be like a high-level name for what our project is, and then it'll go down into like what those high-level features may be. So for example, I want to put a music player on my phone, right? And most frequently, I'll have a set of features such as I want to be able to play the music, store it. I want to maybe buy music, take music off, right? Things like that. Those would be those high-level features. They might define some success metrics, such as maybe a launch date. But what we find is that most companies really quickly start jumping into defining features, the qualities about them, requirements, and design. And we don't really understand, well, what problem, or maybe it's an opportunity that we're trying to take advantage of. So realistically, this is probably not going to change, right? I can tell you on almost every project that I'm on, I'm given a set of features, right? Hey, we want to build X. In fact, I just started a project last week where it's exactly that, right? We've got an old, ancient application. We still need this feature and functions. Let's rebuild this, but on newer technology. So what we will need to do, though, is we need to kind of back up a little bit. And we're actually in the process of doing this, where we need to understand, well, what problem there is that we're trying to solve. All right. And so we're asking, why is that a problem? So I've got my product concept. I've got a whole list of features that this product needs to have. And so now what I'm doing is I'm going back, and it's kind of an iterative process here where I'm going back and forth and understanding, well, what problems does the existing software have today? Why is it that we need to fix that? What does it look like when we don't have this problem anymore? Why is it that, what would happen if we didn't fix the problem, right? What have you tried in the past? Those sorts of questions that really help us develop a real good, clear understanding of what the objectives are. And once we have that, what we can then do is we can start to say, well, gosh, is our product concept still the same? Maybe the features adjust and the features change as well. So another example, and we had a customer that was insisting that they wanted to implement a full learning management system for all of their salespeople. Pretty expensive endeavor, right? These learning management systems can be very big and very robust. And so when we started to look into why they wanted this, we began to understand that they really only cared about a few things. They wanted a system that made it easy for their salespeople to get to and to get that training. And they wanted it to make it easy for them to learn about the features that that company sold so they could sell more. They didn't necessarily want their salespeople to have to take the training. They didn't want them to take training on how to use the system, right? They just wanted to be able to go ahead and make it very intuitive. And they wanted a way to incent their salespeople to take this training, right? Now that we understood that, we could actually start cutting a lot of features that these full learning management systems actually contain, because what they needed was something much similar. And it was a much smaller system, and that's what we ended up focusing on. So what does this model look like? Well, it's actually pretty visual, right? This is our template that we use. Colors might be slightly different, but this is the template that we use. And I'll give you an actual example of one here in a few moments. But what I wanted to point out here is that we could actually have an iterative hierarchy. And as we move from left to right, that things will start to get a little more clearer. And the reason why we have these layers per se is that because our universe is rarely as simple as I have a problem, I have an objective, and ta-da, right? I have a product concept and all of these features that are going to go in here. Usually, right, our lives are a little more complicated here, where I've got a problem and I have an objective, but then I got other problems that are preventing me from achieving that objective. And so we actually have these layers, and putting it into this sort of format helps show us the various relationships between our objectives and our problems, right? It's possible that one problem may have one objective or multiple objectives, and that may blow out into additional problems and additional objectives. I think the largest one of these I've ever created had 5 layers. Now, we were dealing with some very organizational level problems here, but it was 5 layers deep, and it was huge. I will also say that we actually like to do this very visually as well. Yes, we could write it all out, and we could have words and walls of text that explain all of this. But by doing this visually in a manner like this, and we use diagramming tools such as Lucidcharts or Visio or Miro, etc., tools like that, we use that because it forces us to do a couple of things. So first off, our audience for this tends to be our senior managers and executives. Guess what? They're super busy, right? They don't have a lot of time to read walls of text. They need things very concise and clear and to the point. And while I can make these boxes bigger, they can only get so much bigger, right? There's limits. So it forces me, right? Somebody who likes to make sure that everybody has all of the information that they ever needed, because I'm a very detail-oriented person and I want to make sure you have all of this information. It forces me to be concise. Having it visually also catches people's attention. They don't expect to see this sort of information presented in this format. So if you hand them a document, or if you're showing this in a slide, it catches people's attention and they stop and they'll take a look at it, which is awesome. That's exactly what we want them to do, right? We want them to look at it. We want them to say, yes, that's right, or no, it's actually this, right? We want their eyes on it so they can review it. So let's give you an example, all right? So here we go. We're going to talk about this learning management system. And so our core problem is that their salespeople just aren't selling enough products, all right? And so we have an objective, which is to increase our sales to $1 million. And then normally we would probably put some time frame around that. So let's say by Q2 of the following year. But we've got a challenge in achieving that objective. And that is that our salespeople don't understand our products, right? They don't know how to sell it because they don't know what it is. So our next objective is to provide training to 100% of our sales team. And that leads us to a product concept of a simplified learning management system. And we've got 3 key features here: online training, training surveys, and download training. All right. Now, often when I work onto a project, I'm given that product concept and those features. So I can actually work backwards from this, right? And so you can imagine the conversation might go along the lines of, well, gosh, interesting, online training. So why do you want to provide your salespeople with training? Well, guess what? Our sales team, we've got such technical products, our sales team just don't understand what the stuff is. And well, gosh, if they don't understand it, it must make them hard to sell. So is that impacting your revenue? Oh, absolutely. In fact, we're finding that sales isn't selling enough and our revenue is actually decreasing. Okay, so if your revenue is decreasing, do you have maybe, if they know more, do you have a goal on what it might be that you can say, yeah, they seem to get it. They seem to understand these products. Maybe if we can say that if we increase our revenue by X percentage within, a certain time frame, right? So you can imagine that the conversation could go something like that. Now, this is a very simple example, right? They're usually not this simple, but it gives you an idea of what this model might look like. I'll tell you from my experience, the hardest thing here are the objectives, right? We tend to want to go automatically into solutioning mode because that's what we do all day, right? That's what we do. We're solving problems all the time. And so we'll look at that, the sales team isn't selling enough. And instead of saying like increase sales, where we want to go is like, well, we're going to do this for them and we're going to build this and we're going to provide that. So we have to be careful about that to make sure that we're not providing a strategy, that we're actually kind of focused on how we know that we've solved the problem of the sales team's not selling enough, right? And in this particular example, it's because our revenue increases or our sales increases. So you've got to really think of it from that perspective. All right, so we've got our business objectives. That's awesome, right? We've got 3 main features here. But sometimes that's not enough, right? Sometimes we need to go the next step to really understand, well, which of these features should we focus on first? And so we have another model that we use called objective chains. And so we use these objective chains to help us evaluate the value of each one of these feature sets. So that way we know which ones we want to focus on first. Right? I'm not saying that we're not going to rebuild or we're not going to build everything. It's just I want to understand what should I focus on first. All right. So what we do here is we look at how we can link the value of our features back to our objectives, our business objectives. All right. And I'll give you an example about this in a moment here. But you got to remember, our goal is to cut features. Right? And we want to make sure that we're only focusing on those features that are providing the biggest return on our investment. So at the very top of our objective chain here is we have our business objective, right? We've got this right up here. And then there are statements that show, or statements that show how each feature can contribute to those business objectives. And we call those objective factors. Each factor will have an equation in it, right? And then we use that information and the data that we can actually start to create a relative value for each feature, right? Now, where does that information come from and that data come from? Well, it can come from a lot of different places. right? It can come maybe from existing products or maybe something that was similar. Sometimes we're using maybe industry standards, or maybe it's just a reasonable best guess. The point here is not necessarily to be very precise, right? Our intuition is usually good enough, right? So we're not meant to be relatively precise, but we really want to have as an order of magnitude. Okay. And it's very thought out and we're thinking through it. So that way, if we have a senior executive looking at this and they can see the numbers and they can get it, right? They can understand where we came from and how we got to that particular example. All right. Or to that particular dollar valuation. All right. So let me walk you through an example here. All right. So again, we're going back to our learning management system, and we've got two features here that we're going to look at. We're going to look at online training and we're going to look at downloadable training. All right. So we can look at it and we can think about, well, first we understand why training is important, but we're going to go through and look at a couple of assumptions first. Okay. So here's our assumptions in our current state. We know that training is important, and we should think about that if people take training, they actually will pass these tests that they've created as part of the training process. So if we have 1,000 sales reps, and these numbers are just round to make the math easier for us, but let's say we have 1,000 sales reps and 600 of them take the training today. And of those who take the training, 90% pass the tests if they've gone through the training. We've also found that if they haven't taken the training, only 25% will actually be able to pass those tests. So with these numbers, we can say of our 1,000 sales rep, 640 sales rep will pass the test today. Now, we've also done some research and analysis, and we have found that if our salesperson has been trained, they can actually sell about $200 more per day than somebody who hasn't been trained. So taking this information, then we can say, we can start to back into our formulas here, all right? So we have found for online training, right, through our analysis and our questioning and everything, that participation for online training increases about 30%, which means we have about 300 more sales reps that are taking the training than was previously. So that's 30% of 1,000, 300, right? Which now means we have 835 people now being able to pass the tests. And you can see the equation that we've got there. Which then means that we actually will sell $39,000 more a day, right? Because we have these additional people. Now, if we take a look at the downloadable training, well, that only increases our participation by 2%, right? And so if we go through again and do all of the math with all of the equation, that means that that feature set is really only about $2,600 a day. So if we're looking at all of this and we're looking at these two features, both are offering a positive return on investment, which one should we focus on first? Right? Should we focus on the one that's going to provide $39,000 a day in more new revenue, or the one that's focused or that's only going to provide $2,600? Hopefully that's a good, clear answer for y'all. Right? Now, again, I'm not saying we're not going to do the downloadable training. It's just we're going to focus on the online training first. Let's get that bigger bang for the buck done. We're going to take and use all of our resources to accomplish that first, and then we'll move on to the next one, right? And then hopefully we'll get that done as well. But if we don't, that's okay. All right. I wanted to give you another example as well. So one of our customers was adding functionality to a call center application that they had. And this project had three main features. One was to allow a sales rep to edit the customer shopping cart from online and place the order for them. Another feature was to be able to push the edits back to the customer and let them complete it. The third was to allow the customer to see real time the edits from the rep. And the overall, this project had an estimated return on value of $14 million. And this is the one I referenced right at the beginning of our presentation here. Now, the catch was, in order to get this return, it had to be launched prior to the busy holiday season. And by the way, the sales reps had to get involved because this was a pretty complicated product, lots of configuration options that if you didn't get that involved, the customer wouldn't get what they needed. So this was actually a pretty important feature for our particular customer. Now, through the early requirements work that we did, it quickly became clear that the development team was on a path of building a very massive system, and that it'd have no chance of hitting that deadline of being done and complete before the end of the holiday season. All right. So what we wanted to do is we actually wanted to make sure that we were focusing on the things that mattered the most to get us the higher return. So we prioritized our features, and we showed that if we allowed the sales rep to simply go through and edit the cart and complete the sale, we'd probably get about $12 million in return, right? We went through, we did those objective chains that I just talked about, and we came up with each of these features, right? That $2 million for if the customer completed the sale, or if the customer is just editing online with a sales rep, it was only about a $2 million or $250,000 return. So we convinced the development organization to focus on that middle one, that $12 million, right? And long story short, guess what? Lots of long nights, lots of weekend work, but they were able to complete that middle $12 million return on time. And what you're finally able to do is, they were able to get that on time and before the end of the deadline. And the customer was actually extremely happy with that. They never went back and rebuilt those other two items. They just found that it really wasn't worth it, that this was good enough. Now, is 12 million the 14 million that they hoped to have gotten from an ROI? No, but it's a lot better than zero, right? And they were on the path, or we were on the path of delivering zero. All right. So we've talked about why we care. We've talked about how we define them. We've talked about how we use them to help us prioritize. Well, let's talk about why don't we use them today, right? Why is it that we don't all do this in today's world? Well, you know what? There's a lot of reasons why, right? There can be confusion about what they really are. Again, when I'm working with people and when I actually conduct training on business objectives, a lot of people will give us strategies, right? And not the true objectives. And so we have to keep pushing to get to those objectives. Many times management won't even tell us. And I've seen that scenario where they're like, don't worry about it. We know what we're doing, just build us. Sometimes, and I'm sure maybe many of you have seen this as well, sometimes our stakeholders don't want to be measured, right? We're actually making these business objectives measurable. Because if they're not measurable, then we can't go back and see how we did. And they're afraid to be measurable because if we can measure, then it may show that maybe they're not as good as they had hoped, right? So there's that fear there. We see this a lot, especially with middle management. Upper and senior management, nope, they love their metrics, right? They love their metrics. They're very metrics driven. Middle management is the one that tends to get a little bit more nervous about whether or not they want to be measured. And sometimes stakeholders don't actually agree on the objectives. I actually experienced this last year when I was working on a project. And what I had two executives. I had a CIO and I had a COO. And we were working on this massive organizational change for their whole company. And it was a cross-functional team that we were working on. And what I found was that the CIO was saying one thing from an objectives perspective, but the COO was saying something else, and they didn't agree. And what was happening to the project team is that it kind of depended upon what silo you fed up to, right? If you ultimately reported to the CIO, then you were kind of focused on what the CIO said that they wanted to do. If you reported up through the COO, right, you were kind of focusing on that. And as an overall project, we were just churning, right? We were not moving forward. And so what I did here in this particular case is we created that business objectives model, and we forced the CIO and the COO to come together and battle it out, right? Personally, especially as a consultant, I didn't necessarily care which one they chose. I just wanted them to agree. So that way the project could move forward. Took us a long time, right? It took us a long time to build the model. We had 2 3-hour sessions with the CIO and the COO to be able to really battle through and get that agreement that we had with them. But they did it, right? They were able to get to that agreement, and it allowed the organization to move forward. Now, the moral to the story is that unfortunately some habits are hard to die. The COO actually went back and decided, no, I don't necessarily agree. I do want this other thing. And then they fired him, and the CIO actually became the COO. So in the long run, we were able to move forward. But you know what? It cost somebody their job because they wouldn't agree and because they couldn't come to that agreement. So this can be very, very important for that sort of thing. So there's certainly challenges to this, and we continually have to work through. And what I encourage you to do is really go through and think about these, and how is it that you can work through some of these challenges. So some of the challenges that I find is that, it takes time to do this. For us to have a really good first draft, it's about a 2-week effort, not full time, right? I mean, we're doing other things, but it's to hold a meeting, to draft the model, take the information we've gotten, transform it, put it into the model that we showed you, to review it, to have it again, right? And it's kind of that iterative process. Sometimes we get that the data is not collected today, right? They don't know. So we have to convince them that we can use our intuition, that we can use our best guesses to help us figure this out. Many organizations don't want to take the time to be measured. And that's a real hard one. And then I think the last one is after you do all of that work, is don't just put these up on a shelf and say, yep, did it, right? Check the box. No, we need to use them, right? We need to use them as part of our prioritization process. We use them to help us control the scope of our project. Different project I worked on were full into defining features and requirements and writing them all down. We've gone through, developed our business objectives model, got it reviewed. I actually used it as part of my kickoff for the overall project. So that way the entire project team got to hear about it. And, all of a sudden this new set of features came up that didn't map back to many of my business objectives. And so we had to stop, right? And pull the key stakeholders in and say, what I'm hearing here doesn't map back, right? Did we miss something on our model? Completely possible, right? Completely something that we totally missed. Or is it something that we're seeing that it's scope creep, right? Now, what my goal is in that particular example is to make the organization make an informed decision, right? Again, as a consultant, I want them to be successful. If they want to increase the scope of their project, fine and dandy. But I want them to make that informed decision, because if you increase the scope of your project, all of you as project management experts know other things have to change as well, right? The deadline has to change. We need more money, need more resources, or something else has to come off the list, right? We have to make those decisions. And so But consciously saying, yes, we're increasing the scope of this project allows us to be able to say, yep, we can do this. All right, so what if you don't think you can do this? Well, I would argue you probably can. You just got to give it a go. Now, honestly, I mean, your project might succeed if you don't have and don't understand these business objectives, but it's a risk, right? So risk is pretty high based upon our own experiences. And remember, right, combining 7 systems into one is a strategy. That's not a business objective. So if you don't have true business objectives at all, not even non-measurable ones, then I'd start to place odds that the project might be canceled. If it's not really crystal clear on what it is that you're trying to accomplish and the value that's going to provide, then someone may come and look at your project and determine that the value might not be there. And then just cancel the project. In fact, we've even, after doing this model, recommended to customers not to do projects. Now, our salespeople don't necessarily like that, but it's the right thing for the organization, right? The value's not there for you to do this project. We recommend you don't move forward, right? Now, if you have them and they are measurable, well, you're definitely in a better spot. But then try to go through and maybe put some measurements in place. Maybe try to prioritize those features against what you think that they are, and then validate that, right? The issue is still that there may not be enough business justification for the costs, but you're at least moving the organization in order to make those decisions. And that's all I have. So, Susan, I'd like to turn this back over to you.
Betsy, we can't thank you enough for joining us today. It was a pleasure. And we thank everyone for joining us today. Have a great day.